going to speak about poetry and mental illness. But in order to do so, I must speak about spaces and landscapes. I would like to introduce myself to you. How should I explain myself to you? I am a Cape Bretoner, born and raised and recently returned. I am a woman, young, a writer, a poet, and I have bipolar disorder. These are the landscapes in which I dwell. A poet needs her landscapes. Landscapes of hills and lakes, of lovers' faces, a mother's embrace, of her own body. But do we need her? Do we need the poet? I would like to suggest that we do, although I may be rather biased being a poet myself. And a Cape Bretoner needs her landscapes as well. Who would she be as a Cape Bretoner if she couldn't espouse its natural beauties when she is away? If she couldn't share in the round table complaints of the lay of the economy when she comes home? It is my opinion that we live the landscapes in which we find ourselves. We take our identity from landscapes. They do not give identities to us, or rather they do not force them upon us. It is not fair to blame the landscapes. If you resent the identity you take from your landscape, you must either move on to new horizons or take a second look at what is around you. I think it's best to start with a narrative. It is coming on winter, Halifax, November 2010. I am a woman, 20 years old. I have lived with depression my whole life. I have written poetry my whole life. I am studying English, reading poets at St. Mary's University, and my depression is beginning to interfere, as it always does. This time, I'm not sure if the depression is worse or if I'm simply tired of trying to keep it in check, but it starts to ruin things. I fail to keep up the veil that all is well. I fail to hand in my papers. I fail to go to play rehearsal, to keep my friendships alive. I'm failing out of school. I'm failing out of life. I need help. I know it. I am afraid. I go to a doctor. I go to several more doctors. I have bipolar disorder. Mental instability is a familiar place. There are landmarks I have seen and known and revisited my whole life. Now, I name the place. This is bipolar country. Naming the place changes the way I choose to take my identity from it, but the choice remains mine. How do I know I have a choice? I am lucky to have read books, that I have good friends, good family, and good doctors. They have helped me to see the choices in front of me in order that I may choose. I may choose to say that this is not a shameful place to inhabit. Having been given this choice, I would like to help make it available to as many others as possible. Others who live in my landscape or in neighboring towns. I believe this can be done through expression, through poetry, through writing. Practically speaking, I think the message that it is okay to talk about depression and any other type of mental illness is extremely important. It ought to be shown that both ordinary and extraordinary people may suffer from mental illnesses. And it really is suffering if you are undiagnosed and going without treatment. It is like any other disease. With proper care and resources, it is manageable. Like diabetes, cystic fibrosis, even cancer. You wouldn't tell someone with diabetes that it's all in their head and that they just need to get through it and focus on the positive. The brain is an organ like any other, though perhaps more complex and for that complexity harder to care for. Traumatic events may affect your mental health, like a bad injury would affect your physical health. An acute incident that can be extremely damaging in the short term with possible long-term effects. But your mental illness may be less clear-cut. It may be chronic. No easily pinpointed moment of onset, and no particular wound to clean up and close up and set to heal. But just because the source of your illness is not tangible, that doesn't make it any less real. And putting a label on your mental illness can be scary to begin with, because you have to admit to yourself and those around you that it is real. But without getting diagnosed, you still have the same problems. You just lack the tools to overcome them. Another thing I think is very important to consider in presenting this topic is that mental illness, particularly depression, should not be romanticized. I feel this is something that occurs somewhat frequently in popular culture and definitely affects how women view their struggles with the disease, although certainly some men as well. A mental illness is sometimes portrayed as something that's fine for those artistic types. But when faced with the ordinary realities of it, it is seen as distasteful. Female artists, such as Sylvia Plath, for example, who was an American poet who wrote about her depression and later committed suicide, is seen as a fatal woman, overcome by her artistic genius. I think this is a very unfortunate and misleading view. I think poor Sylvia would have benefited immensely from modern medicine. From my personal experience, my writing and other creative pursuits may reflect my personal experience with depression and mania, but I know that my creativity and certainly my productivity has been reduced to near zero whenever I have an emotional fall. My anguish in depression never pushes me to bare my soul, nor does the cloud of euphoria in mania induce me to produce great works, and certainly not coherent ones. And the recognition, interpretation, and articulation of those experiences comes from quiet self-reflection in the aftermath, when I am myself again and trying to make sense of the world. Doubtless all those women writers who suffered from this disease or other mental illnesses would have been much more productive had their illnesses not controlled their lives. Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, Lucy Maud Montgomery all suffered from mental illnesses. Indeed, somewhat recently, Lucy Maud Montgomery's family revealed that she committed suicide at the end of her life. And this was a secret that was long kept in order to avoid stigma. In further regards to romanticization, living with, and that is being in any type of relationship, whether it be romantic or friend-wise or family-wise, with a person who has a mental illness, is nothing farther than from romantic. It can take all of your energy. It is terribly difficult and hard and frustrating and lonely because it is like caring for a sick person, and it can consume your life as much as it consumes theirs. This particular topic is something that I have tried to realize in recent poetic attempts. And finally, for the own sufferer, there is certainly nothing farther from romantic than being afraid of your own mind. While I disagree with romanticizing these artistic figures for their disease, I think the reality is that their work is very important, particularly for those who suffer from similar illnesses. This is because we all simply want to know that we are not alone. And this may be something that's difficult to understand for someone who hasn't gone through depression, for example, that how could reading a poem that describes thoughts of suicide be healthy for someone who has had those same thoughts themselves? And the reality is that you just want to know that you're not the only one. And after that realization, there comes a further step, which is that I have a problem and there are ways to get help. And when I finally chose to see a doctor regarding my struggles with depression and mania, I was at university. It was the fall semester of 2010, and I was enjoying a class in modern Irish poetry as best I could. It was definitely a happy coincidence of circumstances. That is how I view it now. I was in the process of reading authors who had done a great deal with their writing, with their poetry nonetheless. They had effected tangible changes in both personal and larger cultural landscapes. Two authors produced a particular effect on me: Patrick Kavanagh and Evan Boland. Explaining to my exceptional professor, who was my guide through all of this reading, Dr. Sean Kennedy, I framed my experience with them as such. Kavanagh reminded me how exciting it could be to read good poetry, and Boland how thrilling it could be to write good poetry. And in turn, Boland inspired me to make a heartfelt attempt to do so. Kavanagh, writing in the early to mid-20th century, wrestles at the forefront of his poetry with rural identity and seeks to dispel the romanticized myth of the idyllic peasant lifestyle previously appearing in the Irish literary canon. He was writing his lived landscape of a more desolate and difficult rural lifestyle, and receiving rebuke in turn from the literary community, as he was seen as one of these dull peasants who would clearly have no authority on the subject of rural life. His personal struggle with identity runs its course through the narrative of his poetic works in breathless, heart-wrenching, and uplifting manners. As you may well guess, later in his career, his work would be accepted, respected, and produce great influence on other poets, such as Evan Boland and Seamus Heaney. As difficult as it may have been for him to live through the experiences which informed his work, in never failing to attempt to articulate these struggles, he achieved something important. He caused change to happen within a literary tradition, reclaimed a narrative on behalf of not only other writers, but for those who shared a rural narrative in general. Heaney declares in an essay, "Kavanagh gave you permission to dwell without cultural anxiety in the ordinary landmarks of your life." Can you imagine how exciting this is for a young poet? Writing later in life, following a struggle with lung cancer, Kavanagh produces a beautiful work titled Innocence. In it, he discourses his former rejection of the rural identity, and then realization of the power of this identity as it would inform his most groundbreaking poetic works. He articulates a type of transcendence of this struggle for identity, something that most of us will spend our lives attempting to do. And I think that most of us shall succeed, but probably only on certain days. Altering a cultural narrative as a writer is a very exciting concept on an intellectual level. But this type of personal transcendence is riveting and breathtaking on an emotional level. I have admitted to myself that personal narratives interest me much more than cultural or societal narratives. The personal is what inspires my poetry, and perhaps this makes me a less than stellar scholar of poetry, because I usually seek out poems that make me feel something personally. There is an interesting phrase that comes out of the feminist canon of experience, that the personal is political. And Evan Boland is a champion writer in this vein. Her writing is stunning in its innovative capture and expression of the curious circumstance of being a woman and a poet in a time and place where the two identities appear in the cultural and literary narrative to be diametrically opposed. And yet here she was, living both lives. She writes with such a gravity that one, or at least I, hang on the words she has chosen, wondering desperately at the outcomes of her struggles. And through her narrative lens, in the landscape in which she dwells, poetry matters. And again, you can picture me surging with gratitude and delight, because in my landscape, poetry matters too. Kavanagh and Boland taught me that the poet is a cartographer, charting landscapes for fellow and future travelers. And we poets don't simply label the points of interest. We describe them, and in so doing, we interpret them. And through interpretation, we can influence the way things are perceived by the traveler. Through interpretation, we alter our own perception as well. Through writing, we can perform a wild kind of alchemy and turn the misery of our lives into something beautiful, something that brings us joy. And that is the small hope that I have for my poetry, that someone may read it and see that there was once a woman with a mental illness who lived in Cape Breton and wrote about it. And it was okay for her to do so. It was okay for her to live in such landscapes, and that it may be okay for someone else to do the same. Thank you.